My husband told me a terrible secret about his mother. My name is Emily, and life, as I knew it, had always been a mix of hope and determination. When I met David, it was as if the last piece of an intricate puzzle had fallen into place. He was my everything, steady, intelligent, with eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed. We built a life full of dreams, the kind that take root in quiet conversations over cups of late-night coffee and whispered promises beneath warm blankets. Recently, that life became even more vibrant with the arrival of our son, Ethan. He was tiny, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that followed light like it was a new friend. His arrival completed the home David and I had fought so hard to build. Ethan's birth was as perfect as we could have hoped. The first night back from the hospital, David barely let go of him, marveling at his small fingers, tracing the lines of his face. "Can you believe we made this?" he whispered, all lingering in his voice as if he feared speaking too loudly would wake the baby from his peaceful slumber. I smiled, exhaustion weighing heavy on my body, but happiness lifting my heart. Those initial days as new parents were chaotic, wrapped in sleepless nights and endless diaper changes. Yet even in the haze of midnight feedings and learning Ethan's cues, there was joy. We felt like a team, bound together by love and the tiny miracle now sleeping in the bassinet between us. But 3 days after Ethan's birth, a new chapter began, one that none of my late-night reading or motherly instincts could have prepared me for. It started when Carol, my mother-in-law, came to visit. Carol was a complex woman. When I first met her 4 years ago, her silence had said more than her words ever did. She was sharp, with eyes that missed nothing and a smile so rare that when it appeared, it felt like an event. Even when David spoke about her, there was an unspoken tension, an air of past battles left unresolved. Yet, I believed that with time, I could win her over as a daughter-in-law, if not as a friend. One day, that belief had pushed me to the brink when Carol had suffered a terrible car accident. I was the one by her side for 3 months, tending to her with the dedication of someone seeking approval that might never come. I fed her, adjusted her pillows, and read to her from old novels she pretended not to care about. She'd glance at me when she thought I wasn't looking, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. But words of gratitude? They never came. This time, though, I thought things would be different. A new life had joined our family, after all, and even Carol's stoic heart would have to melt a little. Or so I hoped. David was in the living room, bouncing Ethan gently in his arms when Carol walked in. Her coat, the color of storm clouds, matched the expression she wore. I tried to push aside the prickle of nerves that always came when she was near and greeted her. "Carol, it's good to see you." She nodded at me, her lips barely moving. Her eyes, cold and assessing, drifted to Ethan. I waited for them to soften, but they didn't. Instead, she looked up at David, and without so much as a hello said, "David, you need to get a paternity test to make sure the child is really yours." The words were a fist to my chest. The silence that followed was so profound I could hear the faint tick of the clock in the hallway. David's entire body tensed, the muscles in his jaw clenching as he turned to her, disbelief flickering across his face. Ethan whimpered, sensing the sudden change in energy. "Mom," he said slowly, his voice straining to remain calm, "are you serious?" Carol's eyes met mine briefly, then flitted back to her son. She pressed her lips into a thin line, an unspoken confirmation of her resolve. "After everything Emily has done for you, you come here with that?" David's voice cracked, a raw edge surfacing. Carol's response was silence, the kind that said she wouldn't budge, no matter how absurd her accusation was. David stepped forward, shifting Ethan into the crook of his arm. "Emily stood by you when everyone else was too busy. If we're talking about loyalty, maybe Dad should be the one getting paternity tests for all 5 of us. You think your secrets haven't left their marks?" It was as if thunder had cracked across a cloudless sky. Carol's face paled, her composure slipping for the briefest moment. "How dare you?" she spat, her voice quivering, trying to hold on to authority. "I am your mother, and you speak to me like this? After all I've done for you? And you forget what it means to be a mother," David shot back, each word weighted with years of suppressed hurt. "Emily, take Ethan upstairs." I felt the tension like an electric current. Cradling Ethan against my chest, I stepped out of the room, leaving behind the echoes of voices raised in battle. My hands trembled as I climbed the stairs, each step pulling me away from the peace we had once known. As I settled Ethan into his crib, the muffled sound of raised voices drifted up the staircase. I could hear David's deep timbre clashing with Carol's sharper, higher-pitched retorts. The baby stirred slightly, eyes fluttering open before drifting back to sleep. I ran my fingers over the soft down of his hair, trying to find calm in the rhythmic sound of his breathing. But calm was nowhere to be found. The accusations Carol had hurled at me, at us, throbbed in my mind like an open wound. I sat in the rocking chair beside the crib, absently moving back and forth as the shouts below grew sharper. "Sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay me?" Carol's voice was louder now, vibrating with fury. It took me back to the nights I'd spent in the hospital by her side, replaying conversations where silence had done all the talking. How she would watch me with those steely eyes, her pride like a fortress no act of kindness could breach. "You don't get to walk in here and tear my family apart." David's voice cut through, clear and strong. "Emily has been more family to me than you've been in years." I bit my lip, eyes misting as a war of love and resentment raged beneath our feet. I knew David was defending me, his loyalty fierce, but I also knew the toll this was taking on him. His mother's love was something he'd spent a lifetime earning, often to his own detriment. Unable to bear the tension any longer, I stood and crept closer to the top of the stairs. Peeking through the banister, I saw David standing with his fists clenched at his sides, his face a mix of anger and exhaustion. Carol stood across from him, her posture rigid, a defiant tilt to her chin. For a fleeting moment, I noticed the slight tremor in her hands, but she quickly hid them behind her back. "How can you even suggest such a thing?" David continued, his voice hoarse now. "Ethan is my son. Emily is my wife. I won't let you poison this home with your doubts." Carol's gaze faltered, just for a second, before she found her footing again. "You're blinded by your loyalty," she said, her tone colder, sharper. "But I'm not, David. You don't know everything. There are truths that—" "Enough," he said, cutting her off. The room was thick with the silence that followed, as if every word had been sucked out of the air. "You don't get to drop cryptic warnings and leave destruction behind." I felt the walls of the house shift, as though they were holding their breath. My heart thudded loudly, a slow and uneasy rhythm. A part of me wanted to storm downstairs and face Carol, to demand why she would come into our lives at such a fragile time and sow doubt. But I knew it wouldn't help. She wasn't here to listen. She was here to exert control. David's voice softened then, taking on a pleading note that almost broke me. "Mom, why? Why now? We just brought Ethan home. This should be a time for peace, not this." Carol's expression hardened again. "Sometimes peace is a lie, David, and it's better to know the truth than live comfortably in deception." I heard the scrape of a chair and felt my breath catch as David sat down, his head dropping into his hands. He didn't respond, and for a moment, neither did she. The house seemed to sigh in exhaustion, the quiet stretching until it was almost unbearable. Finally, Carol turned on her heel and walked out, the slam of the door echoing like a final note in an unfinished symphony. I rushed back to Ethan's room, just as I heard the creak of footsteps coming up the stairs. David appeared in the doorway, his shoulders slumped, eyes dark with weariness. He looked at me, and I saw not just anger, but the weight of a boy's shattered illusions of what family should be. "She's gone," he said, his voice thin and broken. "For now." I nodded, unsure of what to say, and wrapped my arms around him as he buried his face in my shoulder. We stood there, holding on to each other as the shadows lengthened around us. The night fell around our house like a curtain, deepening the quiet that Carol had left in her wake. I held David's hand as we sat on the couch, Ethan cradled between us, oblivious to the tension that hung in the air like smoke. David's gaze was fixed on a spot across the room, but I could tell he was somewhere far away, lost in memories that only he could see. David, I whispered, squeezing his hand gently. He blinked, as if coming out of a trance, and turned to me with eyes that were both weary and distant. I could feel the question teetering on my lips, but I hesitated. He spoke first. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely reached above the hum of the heater. His eyes darted away, unwilling to meet mine as he continued. "There's a memory I've carried since I was a kid. Something that never made sense until today." My heart began to pound, the soft, even breaths of Ethan the only thing grounding me in the moment. David's jaw tensed, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his own knee. "When I was about 9, I woke up one night to the sound of voices. Loud, angry voices. I crept down the stairs and saw Mom arguing with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, had this deep voice that seemed to fill the room. He was accusing her of something about a child." He paused, swallowing hard. The silence that followed felt too heavy, like it might crush us both. "What did he say?" I asked, my voice trembling. David shook his head slowly, his eyes finally meeting mine. I didn't understand it then, but he was shouting that I wasn't my father's son, that one of the kids, was his. I remember Mom crying, telling him to leave. I remember the look on her face when she saw me at the top of the stairs. It was a mix of shock and fear. I felt a chill run down my spine as the pieces began to align, each click of realization louder than the last. It was one thing to suspect that Carol was protecting a secret. It was another to know that David had lived under its shadow for years without understanding it. "And you never told anyone?" I asked, my voice soft, afraid to shatter the fragile moment. He laughed bitterly, a sound with no humor. "Who would I tell? My father was strict, unapproachable. And Mom, well, she made it clear that what I saw was never to be spoken of again." I reached out, placing my hand on his. The warmth of it felt small against the weight of what he'd just revealed. "David, we need to make sense of this for Ethan's sake." 4 hours? David's expression shifted, a glimmer of resolution breaking through the exhaustion. "I know," he said, "but first, I need to confront her with what I remember. She's held this over us for long enough." The words lingered between us, promising more battles yet to come. The room, though quiet, seemed to buzz with anticipation, as if even the walls were bracing for what would unfold next. Ethan stirred, a tiny yawn escaping his lips, reminding us both that amidst the storm, there was still a center worth fighting for. David pressed a kiss to the top of Ethan's head and then looked at me with eyes that were no longer distant, but full of quiet determination. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll start getting the truth." I nodded, a flicker of hope sparking in the tension. Whatever Carol's secret was, we were done being caught in its crossfire. The morning came with a heavy stillness, the kind that made the house feel like it was holding its breath. David was up before the sun, moving around the kitchen with slow, deliberate motions as he brewed coffee and stared out the window. I watched him from the doorway, the blue-gray light of dawn casting shadows under his eyes. He hadn't slept, and I knew better than to push him into talking before he was ready. "I'm going to see her today," he finally said, breaking the silence. The determination in his voice was unwavering, but beneath it, I could sense the uncertainty, the pain that came with revisiting an old wound. "I want to come with you," I said, stepping closer. David turned to me, the hint of a smile touching his lips, more tired than reassuring. "No, Am," he said, shaking his head. "This is something I have to do alone. If it goes badly, I don't want you caught in the middle of it." His eyes found Ethan, who was babbling happily in his playpen, oblivious to the tension coiling around us. "Besides, I need you here with him." I nodded, understanding but not liking it. The idea of David facing Carol alone twisted my insides with worry. But I trusted him, even if the path ahead was dark and uncertain. "Just promise me you'll be careful," I said, placing a hand on his arm. He covered it with his own and squeezed gently. "I promise." As the morning moved on, David left for his parents' house, the air around him taut with purpose. I stood at the window, watching him disappear down the street, a sense of foreboding settling over me like a blanket I couldn't shake off. Ethan's laughter was a bright interruption, and I turned to see him grinning up at me, his tiny fists waving in the air. I forced a smile and scooped him up, pressing my nose to his cheek and breathing in his baby scent. It was a small comfort in the storm. Hours felt like days. I paced the living room, glancing at the clock more times than I could count. The quiet stretched thin, broken only by the occasional hum of a car passing outside or the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. Then, at last, the sound of the front door opening jolted me from my restless vigil. David walked in, his face pale, eyes shadowed with emotions that hadn't yet settled. He closed the door behind him with a soft click and stood there for a moment, not moving, not speaking. "David," I prompted, my voice hushed. He looked up, and I saw the battle etched in the lines of his expression. He let out a shaky breath and walked over, sinking onto the couch as if his legs could no longer hold him up. I sat beside him, the question in my eyes urging him to speak. She didn't deny it. He finally said, each word like a stone dropping into the quiet between us. When I brought up that night, her face changed. I've never seen her look like that, caught between shame and anger. She admitted there was a man, and that he threatened to expose her. But she wouldn't say which of us he was talking about. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the truth he'd uncovered had shifted the ground beneath us. "Did she say anything else?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. David's eyes narrowed, the hurt in them giving way to frustration. Only that she did what she had to do to keep the family intact, to protect her version of the truth. I felt a flare of anger rise in my chest, sharp and hot. Protect? By tearing apart her own son's family? By questioning Ethan's paternity? The disbelief in my voice trembled with fury. David reached for my hand, grounding me. "I don't think she knows how to do anything else," he said quietly. "Her whole life has been about control. Even now, she couldn't let go of it enough to tell me who she was really protecting." The realization sank in slowly, a cruel twist to an already tangled story. Carol's silence was a shield, one that kept her from fully exposing the secrets she'd buried, but at the cost of everything else. "Where do we go from here?" I asked, exhaustion weighing down each syllable. David's eyes softened, a glimmer of resolve returning. "We go forward. We find out the truth, even if it means tearing down everything she's tried to hide." I nodded, feeling the edges of hope and determination harden inside me. We wouldn't let Carol's secrets rule our lives any longer. The evening shadows crept across the living room as David sat next to me, his hand trembling slightly in mine. Ethan had fallen asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in our hearts. David's eyes, usually so bright, were now dark with memories that seemed to pull him back to another time. "Emily, there's more I need to tell you," he said finally, breaking the silence that had settled around us since he'd returned from his mother's house. His voice was tight, almost hesitant. I braced myself, sensing that whatever he was about to reveal would be the missing piece in this agonizing puzzle. "Tell me," I said, leaning closer, my voice barely above a whisper. David took a deep breath, staring down at our intertwined hands. "When I was a kid, I overheard something. I must have been 9. I woke up one night to the sound of voices, angry, urgent voices. I crept out of bed and stood at the top of the stairs, hidden in the shadows. Mom was in the living room, arguing with a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with a voice that boomed through the room. I felt a chill run down my spine as he paused, his jaw tightening at the memory. He kept yelling that one of us kids wasn't Dad's, that Mom and he had a child together. I was too young to understand what he meant, but I'll never forget the way Mom looked when she saw me standing there. It was like she'd been caught in a nightmare and couldn't find her way out. I squeezed his hand, trying to anchor him to the present. "David, why didn't you tell anyone?" He let out a shaky laugh, bitter and sharp. "I was 9, Emily. I didn't understand it, and by the time I started to, the moment had passed. Mom never spoke of it, and Dad was never the type you could approach with something like that. But after today, after what she said about Ethan, I can't ignore it anymore." The weight of his words settled between us, a mixture of betrayal, fear, and determination. I swallowed hard, sensing the path this conversation was about to take. "You need to tell your father," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. David's eyes met mine, and I could see the conflict in them. "It's going to break him," he whispered. But beneath the worry, there was resolve. "But he deserves to know. We all do." I nodded, feeling both proud of and terrified for him. "I'll be here no matter what." A small, grateful smile touched his lips before vanishing under the weight of what was to come. The room was quiet, save for the soft tick of the clock on the mantel. I sat on the couch, Ethan asleep in my arms, while David paced the floor. His hand raked through his hair, a sign that the thoughts swirling in his head were threatening to spill over. "Emily," he said at last, stopping in front of me. His voice was tight, the weight of something long hidden pressing down on him. "There's something I need to tell you, something I haven't spoken about since I was a kid." I shifted, feeling the tension crackle in the air. "What is it, David?" I asked gently, my eyes searching his face. He took a deep breath, his gaze dropping to the floor. "When I was about 9, I heard Mom arguing with someone in the middle of the night. I woke up to the sound of shouting and crept to the top of the stairs to see what was going on." I held my breath as he continued, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly would summon the ghosts of that night. "There was a man there, a stranger. He was yelling at Mom, saying that one of us kids wasn't Dad's, that he and Mom had a child together." David's jaw tightened, and I could see the storm of emotions in his eyes. "Mom was crying, telling him to leave, but she never denied it, Emily. And then she saw me." I could picture a young David standing there, confused and frightened, caught in the crossfire of adult secrets. My heart ached at the thought. "Did she say anything to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head slowly, eyes distant. "No." She froze, and so did I. Then she just told me to go back to bed, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, she acted like it was a bad dream. But I knew it wasn't. I knew it was real. I reached out, placing my hand over his. "And you've carried that with you all these years? Alone?" David looked at me, his eyes full of guilt and sadness. I didn't understand it back then, and by the time I did, it felt too late to bring it up. But now, after what she said about Ethan, I can't pretend anymore. "We need the truth, Emily." I nodded, my mind spinning with the implications. "Then you need to tell your father," I said, the realization settling over us like a heavy blanket. "He deserves to know." David's face contorted with pain. "It's going to destroy him." I squeezed his hand, my own resolve hardening. "It might, but living in the dark is worse. He deserves the chance to confront this, to decide what to do with the truth." David's eyes searched mine, looking for reassurance. Slowly, he nodded. "I'll tell him tomorrow." The following evening, David and I stood on the front porch of his parents' house. The old wooden door loomed before us, its familiar chipped paint suddenly seeming more like the barrier to a fortress than a welcome entry. I could feel David's pulse in the grip of his hand, strong and quick. He glanced at me, and I gave him a nod of silent support. "Let's do this," he whispered, more to himself than to me, before pressing the doorbell. The chime echoed through the house, and moments later, James opened the door. His eyes, lined with age and worry, looked surprised to see us. "David, Emily," he said, stepping back to let us in. "What's going on?" David's eyes darted to the familiar family photos on the walls, each frame a piece of a life that now felt like it was held together by strings. We walked into the living room, and James followed, sensing the tension. He sat in his worn armchair, the one that always creaked under his weight, and motioned for us to sit across from him on the couch. "Dad, I need to tell you something." "It's important," David said, his voice already thick with emotion. James's brow furrowed. He sat up straighter, his fingers lacing together in his lap. "Go on, son." David took a breath, stealing a glance at me before turning back to his father. "When I was 9, I overheard Mom fighting with a man. I didn't recognize him, but he was yelling that one of us kids wasn't yours, that he and Mom had a child together." James's expression shifted from confusion to shock, his eyes going wide. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. David's voice softened, a tinge of pain creeping in. I was too young to understand what it meant at the time, and she never said anything to me afterward. She just acted like it didn't happen. James finally found his voice, though it wavered. "Why are you telling me this now, David?" His eyes searched his son's face, looking for answers in the lines of worry and regret. "Because 3 days after Ethan was born, Mom came to our house. She suggested I get a paternity test. It felt like she couldn't hide whatever it was anymore, that the truth was seeping out in every word." A heavy silence fell over the room. James's hand, steady and strong all David's life, began to tremble. "She questioned your child's paternity? After all these years?" David nodded, the guilt clear in his eyes. "I didn't know how to bring this to you, Dad. But we need to face it now, for all of us." James stood abruptly, his chair creaking in protest. He walked to the window, staring out into the dark yard, as if the night held answers he couldn't find inside. "We'll get paternity tests," he said at last, his voice clipped but resolute. "If there's any truth to this, I need to know." David took a breath, stealing a glance at me before turning back to his father. "When I was 9, I overheard Mom fighting with a man. I didn't recognize him, but he was yelling that one of us kids wasn't yours, that he and Mom had a child together." James's expression shifted from confusion to shock, his eyes going wide. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. David's voice softened, a tinge of pain creeping in. "I was too young to understand what it meant at the time, and she never said anything to me afterward. She just acted like it didn't happen." James finally found his voice, though it wavered. "Why are you telling me this now, David?" His eyes searched his son's face, looking for answers in the lines of worry and regret. "Because 3 days after Ethan was born, Mom came to our house. She suggested I get a paternity test. It felt like she couldn't hide whatever it was anymore, that the truth was seeping out in every word." A heavy silence fell over the room. James's hand, steady and strong all David's life, began to tremble. "She questioned your child's paternity? After all these years?" David nodded, the guilt clear in his eyes. "I didn't know how to bring this to you, Dad. But we need to face it now, for all of us." James stood abruptly, his chair creaking in protest. He walked to the window, staring out into the dark yard, as if the night held answers he couldn't find inside. "We'll get paternity tests," he said at last, his voice clipped but resolute. "If there's any truth to this, I need to know." The air felt thin in the days that followed. The results of Rachel's paternity test sent shockwaves through the family, leaving a silence that spoke louder than any argument could. James moved through the house like a shadow, his eyes vacant, shoulders slumped. Carol stayed away, making herself scarce as the implications of the truth sank deeper into everyone's lives. David sat at our kitchen table one evening, his head bowed, fingers raking through his hair. I set a mug of tea in front of him, but he barely glanced at it. "It's all falling apart, Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad won't even stay in the same room as her. He's meeting with a lawyer tomorrow. I did this. I broke everything apart." I pulled up a chair and reached for his hand. "You didn't break anything, David. The lies were already there, buried beneath the surface. All you did was uncover them. It's painful now, but it's the only way any of you can move forward." He looked at me, his eyes rimmed with guilt and exhaustion. But seeing Dad like this, seeing Rachel cry, and Mom, she's lost everything she was trying to hold on to. I squeezed his hand, my voice soft but firm. "Holding on to a lie only delays the truth. Your dad needed to know. Rachel needed to know. And even your mom, she has to face what she did." David's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he was quiet, letting my words sink in. "I just wish it didn't feel like I threw a grenade into the only family I've known." I leaned in closer, my eyes meeting his. "Sometimes healing starts with destruction, David. Your family deserves the chance to build something real, even if it means starting from broken pieces." The next morning, James called a family meeting, his voice over the phone carrying a weight I'd never heard before. When we arrived at the house, Rachel was already there, her eyes puffy and red. Carol sat in a corner, her posture rigid, avoiding everyone's gaze. James stood in the middle of the room, holding the papers from the paternity test like they might burst into flames at any moment. "I've started the process of divorce," he said, his voice as steady as he could manage. Carol flinched, but she said nothing. This family was built on trust, and that trust was broken in a way I can't repair. Rachel's chin quivered, but she nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the truth she was still grappling with. James turned his gaze to David, the hardness in his expression softening for the first time in days. "David, thank you for telling me," he said, his voice breaking. "It hurts, but it's better than living a lie." David's breath caught, and he nodded, his eyes glistening. "I'm sorry, Dad. I never wanted this." "I know, son," James said, his eyes filled with a tired kind of gratitude. "But now we can begin to move on." Carol's eyes, filled with a mix of regret and defiance, finally met James's. "I thought I was protecting what we had," she whispered, her voice fragile. James shook his head, a sad smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "You protected a lie, Carol, and now we all have to pay the price." That evening, David and I sat on our porch, the cool breeze carrying the scent of autumn leaves. He stared out at the street, his expression thoughtful but less burdened. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted, turning to me. I reached out, slipping my arm around his waist. "We face whatever comes one day at a time, and we do it together." For the first time in days, David's lips curved into a small, hopeful smile. The weight on his shoulders seemed to ease, if only slightly. The darkness of the past was still there, but now there was a path forward. A few weeks passed, bringing with them the quiet aftermath of upheaval. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, a testament to how ready James was to sever ties with the betrayal that had defined so many years of his life. Rachel had started spending more time with us, coming over for dinners and sometimes just to sit in silence, as if being around her brother and me offered a small measure of comfort. One evening, as the sky darkened to a deep indigo, David and I sat in the living room with Ethan, who was happily babbling and stacking colorful blocks. The house felt peaceful, though the tension of the past weeks lingered, a ghost that hadn't fully departed. David's phone rang, startling both of us. He glanced at the screen and sighed when he saw it was his father. "It's Dad," he said, a flicker of worry passing over his features. "Answer it," I encouraged, resting my hand on his arm. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Hey, Dad." There was a moment of silence, and I watched David's expression soften as James's voice came through, rough but steady. "David, I wanted to thank you," James said, the sincerity in his tone breaking through the line. "For telling me? I know it couldn't have been easy." David closed his eyes for a moment, the relief that swept over him palpable. "It wasn't," he admitted, his voice low. "But I couldn't keep it from you, not after what Mom said. You deserve to know." "I do," James replied, a deep sigh following his words. "And now I can start rebuilding. I've been thinking a lot, and I realized that living in the dark all those years was worse than knowing the truth." David's eyes met mine, and I saw the guilt that had been weighing him down begin to lift, replaced by a tentative hope. "I just wish it didn't have to happen this way," he said quietly. James's voice softened. "Sometimes life forces us to see things we've tried to ignore. I'm proud of you, son, for standing up and facing it, for facing me with it." The words hung in the air, a balm over the wound that had opened between them. David's eyes glistened as he swallowed hard. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." There was a pause, as if James was gathering himself. "Take care of that family of yours, David, and tell Emily. Tell her I appreciate everything she's done for you." "I will," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, son." When David hung up, he sat back, the corners of his mouth lifting in a smile that was small but genuine. He reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine. "He thanked me," David said, as if he still couldn't quite believe it. "I didn't think we'd get here. Not after everything." I squeezed his hand and leaned my head against his shoulder. "You did what was right, even when it hurt. And now, you both can start to heal." Ethan's giggle brought our attention to him, his little face lighting up as he knocked over his block tower with a triumphant squeal. David laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in what felt like an eternity, and reached over to scoop Ethan into his arms. As I watched them, father and son wrapped in a moment of pure joy, I felt the shadows of the past finally begin to release their hold. We weren't free of them yet, but we were moving forward together. The following weeks brought a slow but steady shift. James, though still reeling from the divorce, began to rebuild his life with an air of quiet resolve. He started coming over for dinners, his presence adding warmth to the house that had been sorely missed. Rachel was still navigating her own emotions, but she found solace in our gatherings, where laughter began to replace the awkward silences. One evening, James sat across from me at the dining table, watching David play with Ethan on the floor. The light from the kitchen cast a soft glow over the room, making it feel cozy and alive. "Emily," James said, his voice thoughtful, "I never thanked you properly for supporting David through all this." I smiled, touched by his sincerity. "David and I are a team," I said. "We'll always stand by each other, no matter what." James nodded, the lines of his face softening. "I'm glad he has you. After everything, seeing you both build a life like this, it's good. It gives me hope." David glanced up, catching the tail end of our conversation. "Dad, we're here for you too. Don't forget that," he said, a playful grin breaking through as Ethan wobbled toward his grandfather with outstretched arms. James's eyes shimmered as he scooped Ethan up, the baby's laughter filling the room. It was the sound of resilience, a reminder that even when the past left scars, it didn't have to define the future. Months passed, and with them, the raw edges of pain smoothed over, leaving behind a quieter, wiser understanding of what family truly meant. James found an apartment nearby, a space that was small but full of light. He filled it with books and photographs, new memories that anchored him to the present. Rachel began to embrace her independence, stepping out of the shadows of doubt and learning to rebuild her sense of identity. She visited often, always greeted with open arms and the scent of whatever dinner David and I had managed to put together amidst Ethan's boundless energy. One warm spring evening, we gathered in the backyard. The air was fragrant with blooming flowers, and the sound of crickets serenaded us as the sky deepened from pink to a rich blue. James sat beside me, nursing a glass of iced tea as he watched David chase Ethan across the lawn, their laughter blending into the night. "Things are better," James said quietly, breaking the peaceful silence between us. "Not perfect, but better." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words. "Perfect isn't what we need," I replied. "We just need real." He looked at me, a small, knowing smile on his face. "Real is good. Real is enough." David called out from the yard, waving for us to join in the game. James chuckled, the sound light and easy, as he set down his glass and stood up. I watched as he moved to join his son and grandson, the years of betrayal and loss no longer weighing him down as heavily. As I stepped into the yard, the cool grass beneath my feet, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Our family had been tested, shattered, and remade. But through the trials, we'd found a path forward, one that honored the truth and welcomed forgiveness. David met my eyes, a smile breaking across his face as he pulled me into their circle. The echoes of the past lingered, but now they were just that, echoes. What surrounded us was stronger, built on honesty, love, and the unbreakable bonds that had weathered the storm. We were a family, imperfect but real, and that, more than anything, was enough.